The chains were still warm from the sun when Idella Vance knelt down in the gravel with her late husband's bolt cutters and started working the first lock free. She didn't know the men's names yet. She didn't know what they'd done to deserve being left there, or if they'd done anything at all. She only knew it was 94 degrees in the shade and nobody, guilty or not, should die of thirst behind a boarded-up gas station in the middle of a Tuesday. If you believe in kindness and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner 2.0. The gas station had belonged to her husband, Wendell, for 31 years. It sat off Route 9 outside a town called Cassidy Springs, a place too small to have a stoplight but big enough to have an opinion about everybody in it. Wendell had passed 6 winters back, and Idella had kept the pumps dry and the windows boarded rather than sell the lot, mostly because she didn't know what else to do with a piece of land that held so many of her Tuesdays. She still drove out there twice a week, partly to check the roof for leaks, partly because the drive gave her something to do that wasn't sitting in her kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum. That particular Tuesday in July, she'd come out later than usual because her knee had been acting up and it took her longer than it used to just to get dressed and find her keys. She parked her Buick in the same spot she always did, under the sagging metal awning, and it was the quiet that struck her first, not the good kind of quiet, but the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. Then she heard a groan, low and rough, coming from around the side of the building near the old blue drum barrel. She almost didn't go look. She was 74 years old and lived alone, and every piece of advice she'd ever been given about strange noises told her to get back in the car. But her legs carried her around the corner before her better judgment caught up, and there they were, 4 grown men sitting against the rusted wall of the station, wrapped in chain from their shoulders to their boots, sweat soaking through their shirts, one of them with his head hung so low his chin nearly touched his chest. The biggest one, a heavy-set man with tattoos climbing both arms and a beard going gray at the edges, lifted his head first. His name, she would learn later, was Garrison Loomis, though everyone called him Loom. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he can't quite believe is real, and he said, in a voice scraped thin from thirst, "Ma'am, you might want to call somebody instead of coming over here." "I might," Idella said. "But nobody's out here to call except me, and you look like you've been sitting in that sun a while." She didn't ask who'd done it to them. Not yet. She went back to her car, got the jug of water she kept in the trunk for the radiator, and gave each of them a drink, tipping the jug carefully because their hands were bound too tight to hold it themselves. Then she went into the old station office, found the toolbox Wendell had left behind, and came back out with a pair of bolt cutters that hadn't been used since he was alive. The chains didn't want to give at first. Her hands weren't what they used to be, and the cutters were heavier than she remembered. But she found a rhythm, squeeze, twist, squeeze again, and one by one the links snapped and fell into the dirt with a sound like a small bell. The man closest to her, the one who spoke first when the chain finally slid off his shoulders, introduced himself as Roscoe Teague. He was maybe 50, silver starting to show at his temples, with the kind of face that looked like it had done a lot of squinting into wind. He rubbed his wrists and thanked her, and then he told her, plainly and without much drama, what had happened. They rode with a club called the Ashwood Riders, mostly retired veterans and a few old friends who liked long roads and short conversations. 2 days before, they'd been coming back from a funeral procession for one of their own, a man named Sully who died of a heart attack in his sleep. On the way home, they'd stopped for gas at a station near the county line and run into a group from a rival club called Crown Line. Men Roscoe and Loom had history with going back nearly a decade, an old dispute over a stolen bike part that had never really been settled, more insult than injury, but insults have long memories in that world. Words were exchanged. Then more than words. The Crown Line men, 6 or 7 of them, had jumped Roscoe's group before they could even get back on their bikes, and instead of a straight fight, they'd chained the 4 Ashwood men up and dragged them out to the abandoned station, apparently intending to leave them there as a joke gone too far, a message about who owned the roads around Cassidy Springs. Someone had taken pictures on a phone before they left. Nobody had come back to check on them since. "We figured we'd sit here till somebody drove by," said the third man, Milo Church, younger than the others, maybe 30, with long dark hair stuck to his neck with sweat. "Didn't figure it'd be a grandma with bolt cutters." Idella almost smiled at that, though her hands were shaking a little from the effort of the cutting. "I'm not anybody's grandma out here," she said. "Just a woman who wanted her gas station back." The fourth man, Fenwick Cray, called Fen by the others, was the quietest of them, and when the last chain fell off him he didn't say anything at all. He just sat there for a moment with his head in his hands, and Idella recognized something in that posture, not embarrassment exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent his whole life being looked at a certain way and has just spent 2 days proving people right about it. She gave them the rest of her water and half a sleeve of crackers she kept in the glove box for her blood sugar, and she offered to drive into town and call the sheriff. Roscoe told her not to bother. "Sheriff out here knows both clubs," he said. "It'll turn into a headache and nothing else. We just want to get our bikes back and go home." Their bikes, it turned out, had been left about 2 miles up the road, ditched in a drainage ditch by the Crown Line men after they were done making their point. Idella drove the 4 of them there in 2 trips in her Buick, since they couldn't all fit at once, and watched as they pulled their motorcycles out of the mud one at a time, checking for damage, saying very little. Before they rode off, Loom turned back to her and asked if there was anything they could do to pay her back. Idella waved a hand like she was shooing a fly. "You can not get chained up again," she said. "That'll do." She didn't think much more about it after that. She drove home, made herself a cup of tea, and sat on her porch until the sun went down, the way she did most evenings. Her son Trevin called that night from Amarillo, where he'd moved for work 2 years back, and she almost told him about the bikers, then decided against it. Trevin worried enough about her living alone and driving out to that gas station by herself. He'd been telling her for months she ought to sell the property and move into the assisted living complex near him, and she knew if she told him about 4 chained-up bikers he'd use it as proof positive that Cassidy Springs wasn't safe for a woman her age to be rattling around in alone. So she kept it to herself and talked instead about the tomatoes coming in late this year on account of the dry spring. What she didn't mention to Trevin, what she'd been avoiding mentioning to anyone, really, was the letter that had come from the county assessor's office 2 weeks earlier. The gas station property, sitting empty and unpaying for 6 years, had fallen behind on its taxes by an amount that had crept up slowly the way debts do when a person keeps meaning to deal with them later. The letter said if the balance wasn't settled by the end of August, the county would move to auction the land. Idella had read it 3 times at her kitchen table, then folded it back into its envelope and put it in the drawer where she kept old photographs, as if not looking at it might make it less true. It wasn't only sentiment keeping her attached to that lot. Wendell had left her a small pension and not much else, and the gas station, worthless as it looked, was still hers outright, still worth something on paper even if nobody would ever pump gas there again. Losing it to the county wasn't just losing a memory. It was losing the one thing standing between her and moving in with Trevin's family in a spare bedroom she didn't want, in a city she'd never liked, at an age when she still wanted her own key to her own door. She'd tried, in her own quiet way, to come up with a plan for the tax bill before the letter had even arrived. She'd looked into a small loan at the credit union in town, but the manager, a polite young man who couldn't have been older than 30, had explained to her twice, gently, that a piece of land with no income attached to it wasn't much collateral, no matter how long her family had owned it. She'd thought about selling her mother's silver, the set that had come down through 3 generations and sat wrapped in felt in the hall closet, but every time she opened that closet door she couldn't quite bring herself to carry the box out to the car. Some debts, she'd decided, she would simply have to sit with a while longer, the way she'd sat with most things since Wendell died, not solving them exactly, just getting used to their weight. She didn't tell any of this to the bikers, of course. Why would she have? To her mind, freeing 4 strangers from a chain wasn't a story worth repeating, just a Tuesday that had gone a little differently than most. And there was something else underneath that reasoning too, something she wouldn't have admitted out loud even to Trevin. She didn't like the idea of being pitted. She had been the wife of a man everyone in Cassidy Springs had respected, a woman who used to bring casseroles to other people's hard times, not the other way around. Needing help felt like a coat that didn't fit her yet, one she wasn't ready to try on in front of strangers, even strangers who owed her their gratitude. 3 days passed. On Friday afternoon, a truck she didn't recognize pulled up outside her house, a modest place on Belhaven Street with a wraparound porch that had needed painting for longer than she cared to admit. Roscoe T. got out of it, this time without chains and without the wariness he'd carried at the station. He'd brought a young woman with him, introduced as his niece, Corvina, who worked at the county records office in the next town over. Wasn't snooping, Roscoe said, a little sheepish, standing on Idella's porch steps with his hat in his hands. Corvina does the property filing sometimes, and your name came up when she was pulling something unrelated. She recognized it from what you told us about the station. Didn't mean to go digging into your business. Idella felt her face go warm, caught somewhere between embarrassment and a strange, unfamiliar relief at not carrying the secret alone anymore. "It's not something I advertise," she said. "No, ma'am. I understand that." Roscoe turned his hat over once in his hands. "But I wanted you to know we heard, and we didn't forget what you did out there." Man doesn't forget somebody cutting him loose in a 100-degree parking lot when he figured he was just going to sit there till dark. She invited them in for iced tea, more out of habit than anything, and they sat at her kitchen table for the better part of an hour while she told them, in pieces, the parts of the story she hadn't meant to tell anyone. About Wendell building that station up from nothing in 1974. About the years it fed their family when the wheat crops failed twice in a row. About Trevin wanting her to sell up and move, and how she wasn't ready to be a woman who used to have something. Roscoe didn't say much in response. He mostly listened, the way some men do when they've spent a lot of years around engines and know that most problems reveal themselves if you just let them run a while. Before he left, he asked if he could take a picture of the letter from the assessor's office, just the amount owed and the deadline. Idella hesitated, then decided there was no harm left in it, and let him. She didn't hear from any of them for the better part of a week after that, and she assumed, without much disappointment, that the visit had been a kindness paid back in full, a thank you and nothing more, which was more than she'd expected anyway. She went about her days the way she always did, watering the rose bush by the mailbox that Wendell had planted the year they married, listening to the same country station on the radio while she did dishes, driving out to check on the gas station every Tuesday and Friday like it was still a job she had to clock in for. Her neighbor, a widower named Osric Pell who'd lived 2 houses down for as long as she could remember, noticed the truck in her driveway that Friday and asked about it over the fence the next morning while she was out watering. She told him a shortened version. Some men she'd helped out on the road had stopped by to say thank you, and he raised his eyebrows in the particular way he had, the way that meant he had opinions he wasn't going to share unless invited to. Osric had never approved of much beyond his own porch and his own routines, and Idella had long since stopped expecting his approval for anything she did. Still, she noticed he watched the street a little more carefully after that, the way people do when they sense something is shifting nearby even if they can't name what it is. She also found herself thinking, more than she expected to, about the fourth man, Fen, and the way he'd sat with his head in his hands after the chains came off. There was something in that image she couldn't quite put down. She had raised one son and buried one husband and had learned, over the years, to recognize the particular posture of a person carrying more than they were saying, and Fen had worn that posture the way some men wear an old coat, like it had shaped itself to him a long time ago and he'd stopped noticing the weight of it. She didn't know his story and didn't ask for it, but she found herself hoping, in the small idle way a person hopes about a stranger, that whatever had put that posture on him might someday ease up. It was on a Saturday, 2.5 weeks after she'd cut those chains, that everything about that routine changed, though not in the way anyone in a hurry might expect. It started as a sound before it became a sight. Idella was in her kitchen around 11 in the morning, elbow deep in soapy water, when she noticed a low rumble building somewhere out past her window, faint at first, like distant thunder that doesn't quite arrive. She dried her hands and stepped onto the porch, expecting maybe a summer storm rolling in off the plains. Instead, she found the street outside her house filling with motorcycles. Not 4. Not a dozen. They kept coming, in loose columns 2 and 3 abreast, filling Bellhaven Street and then spilling onto the cross streets, engines idling low, riders in leather vests from clubs she'd never heard of, names stitched on patches from towns 2 states over, some from farther than that. She stood on her porch with a dish towel still in her hand, absolutely certain for a moment that she'd misunderstood something, that this couldn't possibly be for her. Roscoe Teague walked up her front path first, on foot this time, his bike parked somewhere in the crowd behind him. He didn't waste time on ceremony. He told her that after he and Loom had gone back to their club with her story, word had traveled the way it does in that world, rider to rider, chapter to chapter, across a network held together by nothing more official than mutual respect and a shared language of the road. Somebody had started a small fund. Somebody else had reached out to clubs they knew in 3 neighboring states. What had begun as an idea to help one old woman pay off a tax bill had turned, over 2 weeks, into something considerably larger than anyone had planned, including Roscoe himself. We didn't set out to make a parade of it, he told her, looking almost apologetic about the size of what stood behind him. It just kept growing. People wanted to be part of it. By noon, the count on Belhaven Street and the streets around it had climbed past 2,000 riders, according to the local paper that showed up an hour later, drawn by a tip from someone who'd posted pictures online. They hadn't come for a show. Many of them had ridden 4, 5, 6 hours to get there, some through the night, just to stand in a residential street in a town most of them had never heard of before that week. A man Idella didn't recognize, wearing the patch of a club called Iron Sable out of 3 counties away, handed her an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check, made out in her name, for an amount that covered not only the back taxes on the gas station but enough besides to fix the roof that had been leaking into the office for 2 winters running. She stood there on her porch reading the number twice, and then a third time, because her eyes weren't cooperating with her disbelief. "We're not doing this because you're some kind of hero," Loom told her, stepping up beside Roscoe. He'd shaved since she'd last seen him, and looked younger for it, though there was still something tired behind his eyes that she recognized from the day at the station. "We're doing it because most folks look at men like us and cross the street. You didn't. That's rarer than you'd think." Idella didn't have a speech ready. She wasn't a woman given to speeches, not even at her own husband's funeral, where she'd stood at the front of the church and said only a handful of sentences before sitting back down. She looked out at the crowd of riders filling her street, engines quiet now, waiting without any particular impatience, and she thought about how strange it was that the smallest thing she'd done that Tuesday, cutting a few chains because the alternative was leaving men to suffer in the heat, had traveled so far beyond her own hands. "I didn't do it for anything," she finally said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, though her voice wasn't built for crowds. "I just couldn't leave you there like that." "That's exactly why we're here," Roscoe said. The gathering didn't last more than 2 hours. There were no speeches, no music, nothing that resembled a spectacle built for cameras, though plenty of cameras were there anyway, held by locals who'd wandered out of their houses to see what the noise was about. Some riders came up to shake her hand. A woman named Persimmon Blythe, who rode with a club out of the next state over and had lost her own mother the year before, told Idella quietly that she reminded her of her, not in looks, she said, but in the way she stood, like someone who wasn't finished yet. Idella didn't know quite what to say to that, so she just nodded and thanked her. Fen, the quiet one from that day at the station, was among the last to leave. He lingered by her porch steps after most of the crowd had begun pulling out, engines starting up in waves down the street like a slow tide going out. He told her, in the fewest words he could manage, that the day she found them chained up had been the worst day of his life in a long while, and that he'd figured, sitting there in that heat, that it was about what he deserved for the life he'd chosen. He said her showing up with those bolt cutters, not asking questions, not judging what he was or wasn't, had done something to him he still didn't have the right words for. "Didn't figure anybody owed us kindness that day," he said. "Especially not somebody who had every reason to keep on driving." Idella didn't have a tidy answer for that either. She just told him that everybody deserves a little water on a hot day, guilty or not, and that the rest generally sorts itself out given time. He nodded like that was enough, and then he was gone too, his bike disappearing down Belhaven Street with the last of them. By evening, the street was quiet again, save for a few flattened patches of gravel dust where kickstands had rested for a couple of hours. Idella sat on her porch with the cashier's check still in its envelope on the small table beside her chair, and she found herself laughing quietly to herself, not at anything funny exactly, but at the strangeness of a life that could hand a woman a July afternoon like that one after so many years of afternoons that looked nearly the same as the one before. She called Trevin that night and told him everything, start to finish, and for once he didn't lecture her about living alone or driving out to a boarded-up gas station twice a week. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then he said, "Mom, I think you might understand something about people that I don't." "I don't know about that," she told him. "I think I just didn't want anybody sitting in the sun." The gas station is still standing today, roof patched, taxes paid in full, though Idella still hasn't decided what to do with the land long term. Some weeks she talks about turning the old office into a little roadside shop selling preserves and honey. Other weeks she says she'll just keep driving out there twice a week the way she always has, because a place doesn't stop being useful just because it stopped selling gasoline. Roscoe and the others still stop by now and then, usually unannounced, usually just long enough for a glass of tea and a little conversation about nothing in particular. Fen brought her a rose bush of his own last spring to plant next to Wendell's, and didn't explain why, and she didn't ask. Trevin drove out from Amarillo not long after that Saturday, the first visit he'd made in almost a year that wasn't tied to a holiday. He stood at the edge of Belhaven Street where the gravel dust still hadn't quite settled and told his mother he was sorry for pushing so hard about the assisted living complex, that he'd been thinking about her safety without much thought for what she'd actually be giving up. Idella told him there was nothing to apologize for, that a son worrying about his mother wasn't a crime, but she was glad, she admitted, that he'd seen for himself what a life built slow over 50 years could still hold. He stayed 3 days that visit instead of his usual one, and helped her clear out the gutters, and didn't mention the assisted living complex again unless she brought it up first. As for the Crown Line men who'd left 4 riders chained against that wall in the first place, Idella never learned much about what became of them, and she found she didn't much want to. Roscoe told her once, briefly, that the matter had been settled between the clubs in a way that didn't involve the sheriff or any further chains, and that seemed to be all anyone wanted to say about it. She understood there were parts of that world that would stay closed off to her, the way there were parts of her own life she kept closed off from strangers, and she didn't feel any need to pry the rest of it open. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. Comment, kindness still exists, if you believe even one good act can change someone's life. What stays with Idella most, when she thinks back on that Tuesday, isn't the crowd of 2,000 riders that filled her street, though she'll never forget the sound of that many engines going quiet all at once out of respect for one old woman's porch. What stays with her is smaller than that. It's the particular silence of 4 strangers sitting chained against a rusted wall, waiting to see if anyone would stop, and the plain, unremarkable fact that she did. She didn't do it to be repaid. She didn't do it because she recognized anything special in the men she found there. She did it because it was hot, and they were thirsty, and the right thing to do rarely announces itself as anything more than that. Kindness, she likes to say now, was never supposed to be complicated. It only looks that way to people who've forgotten how simple it can be to just stop the car.